Coming up on tonight's Nation to Nation, the federal government announced some money for affordable housing, but is Canada building for the future?
Urban Indigenous housing providers and the rental market collectively on the social housing side is disappointed.
A scathing report on gender discrimination at the Assembly of First Nations is now part of the evidence in a Manitoba civil case.
The complainant, she resubmitted, amended her statement of claim, her lawsuit against Arlen Dumas to include this report.
And finally, the ups and downs of air travel in Nunavut years after an airline merger.
Expecting delays is very much a regular part of our expectation when constituents are going for medical travel.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. A little more than 48 hours ago, the federal government announced $1 billion to help build affordable housing. The move comes as rents and housing prices skyrocket. The lack of affordable housing is forcing people to make tough financial decisions. Statistics show that a third of the people without a safe place to stay are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit people living in urban areas. Gignall Nonprofit Corporation is an organization that helps house Indigenous people. They have several properties in the Ottawa area, including this one, which is under construction in the city's Vanier region. Mark Miracle is the executive director, and he joins me today from his office in downtown Ottawa. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you.
So I guess we'll jump right into the yesterday's announcement as part of the fall fiscal update. It's $1 billion over 7 years for a number of different affordable housing programs. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think initially I would say that, certainly the urban Indigenous housing providers and the rental market collectively on the social housing side is disappointed because it simply doesn't address the urgency. Certainly from an urban Indigenous perspective, we've fought long and hard to be included under the National Housing Strategy. We got recognized in 2021, and the monies that are currently on the table are $280 million that's going through an allocation or an application process over the next month and a half, and that money is intended to be spent across the country, and $280 million in housing need for urban Indigenous interests certainly isn't going to go far, so I fully expect that will be completely prescribed by the end of January, which is the time frame that they intend to announce successful projects that will be funded under this amount of funding. There is an additional amount that was identified for urban housing, which was $4.1 billion over 7 years in the last fiscal federal budget. But I think it's safe to say that we won't see that money allocated to urban housing interests, certainly in the short term, and I wouldn't expect this government to survive long enough to realize their commitment of $4.1 billion. That even that is not a full commitment to the need that exists in the urban Indigenous housing sector.
Mm-hmm. As you say, 7 years is quite a long time, so who knows anything. That's a long time for a program. What, in your experience, is the biggest obstacle, I suppose, in providing the safe housing for Indigenous people? Is it finding the available real estate, getting the money to build or start up? What are some of the obstacles?
Well, there's a couple of challenges that we face in any given capital development. The first one definitely is land. And the availability of land, certainly in urban areas, it's expensive. And even when we're dealing with surplus land from different levels of government, their first inclination is to try to maximize the value of that land. So it's not always an easy proposition to access land that's affordable. And certainly in a city like Ottawa, where we might have opportunities around the light rail development, has been bought up by developers years ago, and they're now realizing bigger scale developments, and perhaps some of the best opportunities for urban Indigenous housing groups is to partner with bigger partners to realize the provision and providing choice to community where they want to live.
Yeah, this just brings me to some of the issues that your organization is dealing with. What can you give us an idea of how long your wait list is for housing?
Well, it varies. Gignal Housing has 210 units in 76 buildings, so it's a very complex portfolio. It's across the city of Ottawa from Orleans to Bell's Corners to Barrhaven. We do have a concentration of our units, about 60%, in Vanier, which is on the eastern side of the downtown core. And we're primarily there simply because of affordability. When we were able to purchase units in the late 80s, early 90s, as well as where the greatest need is. That's where there is a concentration of the Indigenous community here in Ottawa, and it's also the location for many of the service delivery organizations. So it presents a better opportunity to coordinate access to appropriate services for the community.
Now, if I guess you did have the ear of the finance minister, there's been a lot of criticism with the government of too little, too late on this housing file for, all Canadians, specifically as we were talking about Indigenous people. But if you did get a chance to talk to Chrystia Freeland, what would you say to her if you had a few minutes?
Well, I think there is definitely an underinvestment in purpose-built rental housing in this country, and certainly for urban Indigenous people, they're among the most vulnerable in terms of housing need. And I think it's been largely recognized for the last, at least since 2015, with a lot of purpose at the federal level. So they're fully aware of the urban dynamic and the need. And so the supply of affordable housing to the urban Indigenous population is number one. And where you see the evidence of the vulnerability in the community, if you live in a large urban area or you're out west in any of the smaller cities, Indigenous homelessness is the face of the homeless population. In Ottawa, we're no different from any large metropolitan area in this country. It's 30% of the Indigenous or the homeless population is Indigenous. It's significant, it's pervasive, it's not going down. In fact, it's increasing. We're experiencing younger people in homeless situations, aging out of institutions. It's also more vulnerable for families and younger women. So violence, drugs, the opioid crisis, the mental health crisis that's been exacerbated by the pandemic, all presents challenges as a housing provider and to the community itself in accessing services and accessing, for sure, safe, affordable housing.
Thanks very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity.
After the break, we'll talk to APTN investigative reporter Kathleen Martins about how an Assembly of First Nations report on harassment and discrimination is now being used in a Manitoba civil court case. You're watching Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. A scathing report written about gender-based discrimination inside the Assembly of First Nations is now part of a court case in Winnipeg. The review has a number of alarming testimonials, including reports of cyberbullying and inappropriate touching. Those details are now being referenced in a civil suit which alleges harassment against former head of Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs Arlen Dumas. APTN reporter Kathleen Martins has been following this story closely, and she joins us today from Winnipeg. Thanks for joining us, Kathleen.
Hi, Fraser. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I guess we'll start right into it. What are your thoughts about this internal AFN report making its way into the civil case involving Arlen Dumas?
Yeah, it was a surprise. The complainant, she resubmitted, amended her statement of claim, her lawsuit against Arlen Dumas to include this report that was released in July. And, I reported on it at APTN because I felt it was a very interesting development.
And what do you think the reason that she did do this, or what is the link here?
Yeah, I think it was an interesting strategy. There have been a few of these reports, one with the eastern region of the AFN, of course this national one with AFN in Ottawa, and then there's been a report at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, all looking at workplace culture. And to see this national one included in a lawsuit, I'm not aware of that happening earlier or before, and I think it gives it some credibility. Also that the complainant says that the items that are mentioned, the bullying, the lateral violence, the unwanted comments, the inappropriate sexual behavior that is alleged in that report at AFN, the complainant here in the Winnipeg lawsuit says that's what she also experienced at AMC. And she was backed up in the similar report that AMC had a law firm do, but it was confidential. So that's not included in her lawsuit.
Okay, and we should note for our viewers, I guess, that Dumas has not actually been charged with any crime, and the allegations against him in the civil case have not been tested in court. I also understand he's countersuing his accusers. That's correct?
That's right. He's filed a statement of defense in which he denies all of her allegations of workplace sexual harassment and sexual assault. And then he also filed a countersuit where he alleges that these accusations she's made against him have defamed him. Okay,
and I guess with this report and the fact that it's involved in this court case, with the AMC, you're saying that their own report confirms some of these things as well. Does this kind of tell you about what some of the has been happening, not only at the AFN, but some other similar Indigenous political organizations of late?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, there have been 3 reports done. They all say similar things. And these aren't just chiefs that are being alleged of this inappropriate conduct. It's also elders and knowledge keepers. The AFN report, for example, talks about, a whisper network. Women are warning other women about who not to be alone in a room with, what to wear when they're at meetings, who to be careful around when they're on the road at events. That is all signs of at least a toxic workplace, if not a predatory culture, which is the wording that is used in the AFN report. And the AFN report was released publicly in July. At the time, the acting national chief said it was disturbing, but it wasn't opened up for any kind of debate or discussion. People could line up in July at the meeting in Halifax where it was released and comment on it, and there was a lot of smudging happening at the same time people were speaking about it because it was so emotional. And this woman's allegations here, they're from one woman, but they seem to echo a lot of the complaints that are made in this report by a number of women who were interviewed who worked at AFN.
All right, so you mentioned how the AFN report was public, it was put out to a third party, and also it's, this change that the AMC actually ended up dismissing Dumas. Do you see sort of maybe a larger sea change happening at some of these organizations? What's happening now?
I think including this report in the lawsuit is making a change. Up to now, it's just been anonymous women in these third-party reports who are making these allegations. This is putting it in a court of law and using it as an actual reference, and she's saying this is what she experienced at AMC. Very similar allegations to what AFN has found. So either they're going to stop doing these third-party reports, or these third-party reports have to now be viewed as something that action needs to be taken on. But I'm not aware of any action that's come out of these reports thus far.
Right. Well, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks very much, Kathleen, for all the hard work you put in on this story and for talking to us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Fraser.
Coming up on the show, complaints against the airline that services Nunavut are on the rise. After the break, we'll tell you why. You're watching Nation and Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. If you're in Nunavut and want to get from one community to another, there's only one way to do it: by plane. In 2019, the federal government allowed 2 airlines to merge, creating a monopoly in the Arctic. Cancellations are common, and there's only 1 flight in and out per week. APTN recently ran a story where it took a young Inuk mother from Grise Fjord a month to get to and from a medical appointment in Ottawa. Laurie Idlow is the NDP MP for Nunavut. I met with her earlier today outside the House of Commons and started by asking her about our story of the Inuk mother.
It is shameful. I think that is one of the more extreme stories that I've heard, but medical travel patients that have no choice but to leave their communities because the health services are not available, for them to have to come to the southern cities is very common. We have a huge medical travel budget, and because of that, expecting delays is very much a regular part of our expectation when constituents are going for medical travel. But that one was definitely a more extreme story, where it's been a whole month that the unfortunate mother had to stay away from her family.
Now, we have heard on the other side of that, people actually, if it's a maybe even if it is a serious medical condition, that they are not, for fear of not making their appointment, they're actually not, they're not making the appointment because they fear they won't be able to make it to that medical appointment in Ottawa, let's say. Is that something you've heard of as well?
Oh, for sure. I know of people that have chosen not to accept their appointment because the medical travel system has told them on that day that they have an appointment to leave. So, like, they have to make drastic changes, and especially mothers who can't leave their children with family to go take their own appointment. So I've definitely heard of people choosing not to go to their appointments because of how long it might take for them to actually get to see a doctor.
Okay, and the merger happened between Canadian North and First Air, I believe, back in 2019, before you're an MP, but I know you're aware of all the issues. Now, at the time, the government guaranteed that it was not going to create any delays, that it was going to be business as usual. Is that really the case, though?
I know that there's always been travel delays and struggles even before this merger. There had always been problems for various reasons that I think the airlines are not the only reason for those delays. Like, for example, the lack of investments in our airports, the lack of investments in the terminal buildings, and the lack of enforcement for air passenger rights. So I think that when that merger happened, it seemed to amplify the stories that were happening after the merger.
Right, and maybe I'll ask you a bit about that. That's a common theme that we've been getting is from Transport Canada when we ask them about these complaints and things that, yes, the government says it's investing in northern airports and northern infrastructure. Is that enough, though?
I think the investments are definitely not enough. For example, I'm sure that as you've been collecting your stories, you've heard of Cambridge Bay, which is the Kitangmiyot hub in Nunavut, the hub for the Kitangmiyot communities, for outlying communities. And because of the lack of paved airport, the Canadian North finally decided to not fly in jets anymore and only fly in ATR-sized planes. And that caused a lot of problems for the whole Kitangmute region. It doesn't impact just the one community, but it impacts all 5 communities. And because those investments are there, it's forcing airlines to make decisions that they have no choice but to make.
And I think we tracked, we got some stats from Transport Canada, and it said about maybe in the area of 120 to 130 complaints since the merger. I know you've brought this up with the government a number of times and your government colleagues. What are the answers that they give you?
They haven't really given me any answers. I know that I still keep having my conversations with Canadian North. I was at the Nunavut tourism conference last week in Iqaluit, and the airline itself said that part of the problem as well is the shortage of pilots, or the shortage of training opportunities for Inuit to become pilots. So if there were more pilots, there would be less cancellations. So needing to invest in human resources so that Inuit could become trained to become pilots could be other ways to help alleviate those pressures.
Let alone the stress that this causes, of course, of being sort of stranded away from family for a month or not knowing getting home. What about costs, that for people that are stranded like this? Is that covered? Are people able to get shelter, food? We've heard some different stories of people having to make do, but are they accommodated when they're stranded like that?
It very much depends on where they're stranded. So, for example, if they're stranded in Ottawa or in Iqaluit, there are accommodations that medical travel can provide. Unfortunately, if they're stranded in a place like Rankin Inlet where there's no boarding home, then they are literally stranded. I've seen photos of people sleeping in airports because accommodations are not to be found in Rankin Inlet, which is another hub for the Kibadlak region. So it always depends on where they are getting stranded, unfortunately, and I think this is something that the medical travel system needs to make major improvements on, is that to always have backup plans, because there will always be travel disruptions, and I think that the medical travel system needs to do a lot better to make sure that their patients are being taken care of, because so many don't have credit cards that they can pay for hotels. So many don't have regular income that they can pay for their meals while they're on medical travel. And so many don't have enough money to pay for ground transportation like taxis to get to their hotels even. So there are a lot of issues when delays are happening for medical travel patients.
Such a big issue, and I'm sure we could ask more questions, but we're going to have to end it there. But certainly, I can only imagine how stressful this must be for somebody being away from home and having to go through that. So hopefully we'll see some movement in the future. And as always, a pleasure. And thanks again for joining us today, Ms. Idla.
Okay.
That's it for Nation and Nation this week. You can continue to follow news on APTN at aptnnews.ca or on our social media sites. And to follow our podcast, go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.